All right, back with another playoff predictions video. Again, if this is your first you've seen, this is less about my actual predictions and more about just going through the scenarios, seeing what each team has to do at this point to make the playoffs, which games are important. Some games actually not even involving playoff teams still could have implications due to tiebreakers, so we'll talk about all that when we get to the NFC West. But yeah, a lot of craziness this week. Let's just get into it. Over here, we're going to go back to the NFC. We're going to start with them this week. You see, are there any surprises? Well, a couple. I think for one, I do still, as of right now, if the 4 games I'm predicting, go the way they go, Tampa Bay would get in as the 4 seed. If they win the 2 games they're favored to win, and Atlanta loses the game they're going to be underdogs in against Washington next week, that would be enough. It's razor thin, though. We'll get into it more once we get into the NFC South. The Rams I do have as the 3 seed now. The Tampa Bay loss to Dallas also helps out them as they have a good shot to get the 3 seed instead of just the 4 seed, which I think matters. You probably don't want to play what's almost certainly going to be Detroit or Minnesota, although not guaranteed. We'll talk about that as well. And then I also have Washington jumping all the way up to the 6th seed. They kind of have been locked into that 7 seed, although they are kind of the one team that really could still find a way out of the playoffs here if things go south, it seems like. If you look at the entire conference as a whole, though, when it comes to making the playoffs with Washington pulling off the upset and beating the Philadelphia Eagles, you're kind of looking at, there still is a way that Washington could lose the tiebreaker. We'll talk about that. But really the 2 teams I would say still fighting for a playoff spot that aren't currently in one as of today are Tampa Bay and Seattle. Let's talk about those 2 teams. Let's start off actually with the NFC West, because that's probably the most complex one here. So first we have the Seattle Seahawks schedule. Keep in mind, as of today, the Seahawks have 1 less win than the Rams. So you might be thinking, okay, well, this isn't that bad of a situation, right? Because you still play the Rams. So you beat the Bears and then you beat the Rams. Now you're tied. The issue is that as things stand today would not get them the tiebreaker. So because of that, they would need some help along with just winning out. The Rams currently play the Cardinals and the Seahawks to end their season. So for the Rams, there is a chance that as long as they just win their next game, that Seahawks game might not even matter. So as a neutral fan, we're all kind of hoping for that game to be a winner take all. But as it stands right now, that would not be the case if the Rams beat the Cardinals. Now, if both teams happen to lose next week, that would actually flip the divisional rankings to since the Rams now have an extra divisional loss, that would flip it over to Seattle actually having the tiebreaker. So then they would be the team that gets in if both lose next week. So that's on Saturday night. That's a huge game for Seahawks fans just as much as Rams fans. However, again, like I said as it stands right now, the Rams would have the tiebreaker if they win to the Cardinals and lose to the Seahawks. That can flip because that would be a strength of victory tiebreaker. How does that work? Well, I spent way too long figuring out myself, but let me try to give you the quick, Cliff Notes version of it. So you see in this very high-tech graph that I have next to me, what you're looking at is the teams that each of these 2 teams, Seahawks and Rams, defeated and how many wins they have. This is excluding the same teams that have been, that they have wins over, because that would just get things a little bit more muddled. So this is a team that, the Denver Broncos are a team that the Seahawks have beaten, but the Rams haven't. That's why they're on the list. You see the total number of wins is slightly in favor of the Rams by 4 games, but can you make up those 4 games? What Seattle would need is their 6 teams that I have to win a total of 4 more games than the Rams the teams do. And I actually do have them winning more games. As it stands right now, I have the Seahawks, the teams for the Seattle Seahawks winning a handful more games. The issue is that the Rams, they would need a little bit more. So I was interested in calculating this, so I did. The way for Seattle to earn the tiebreaker is if everything else holds. I did see a scenario where it could happen. If the Vikings lose to the Packers next week, the Falcons beat the Commanders next week, and the Bills rest their starters and lose the final game of the season, that would then be enough. The Seahawks would get the tiebreaker. So again, just the quick quick explanation here is if you're a Seahawks fan, what you need to do is root against the teams that are in the Rams category and root for the teams that are in your category. For the Rams, you got to do the opposite. It gets very complex, but maybe the easiest way is just, if you're a Seahawks fan, hope the Rams lose next week, and then you're okay. Now let's talk NFC South, starting off with the Atlanta Falcons, who now control their own destiny. If they can go 2-0 and continue being undefeated with Michael Penix Jr. in as quarterback, they will make the playoffs and win the division. It's that simple. That's all they have to do. Now, again, I'm saying it's all they have to do. Not the easiest thing in the world to do, right? That Washington game really feels like that could be the season. And again, Carolina's played better, so that's no guarantee either. But you go 2-0 and you're in a really strong spot. If they lose one of those two games, that opens the door back up for Tampa Bay. The Buccaneers also play Carolina, and they play the Saints, two games that, again, record-wise, you view as, oh, those should easily be wins, but it's worth mentioning that those are two divisional matchups, and the last time the Buccaneers played the Panthers, it went to overtime, so there is no guarantee, but for Tampa Bay, the way into the playoffs, you have to be thinking is they have to go 2-0. It's not a guarantee. Like there is a scenario where they go 1-1, and if the Falcons go 0-2, that would still get the Buccaneers to lead the division. But realistically, 2-0, I think has to be the mindset for Tampa Bay. And then for Washington, they have not clinched yet. So I said Tampa Bay probably has to go 2-0. What's interesting is if they go 2-0 and Atlanta goes 2-0, Atlanta wins the division, and Tampa Bay will still end up with 10 wins, which is Washington's current win total. If all this happens, that would mean that Washington loses next week, and their playoff hopes would entirely come down to week 18. Can they beat the Cowboys, who they did lose to earlier this season? So it's no guarantee that they win. Dallas has been playing better as of late, and even beat Tampa Bay, as we're talking about. So for Washington, next week still matters a big deal. It was a huge win against Philadelphia to just give them some insurance, because had they lost that game, they would essentially need to win out, or they would at least feel like they would need to win out. Now they have that insurance, but got to find a way to win one of the next two games, and you don't want to come down to week 18 if you can avoid it. So big game week 17 for them. As for the 1 seed, the Detroit Lions are still in the driver's seat, right? I still have the Lions getting the 1 seed. They go 2-0. That gets them the 1 seed. It's simple enough. In fact, the way I currently have it standing right now is even if they lose that game to the 49ers, it would still be enough. They would have the tiebreaker over Minnesota. So they are tied with Minnesota as of right now, but even if they drop a game, as long as they then beat Minnesota, that would give them the tiebreaker, and they would still end up as the 1 seed. Meanwhile, for Minnesota, I mean, they could feel like they're in the driver's seat as well. Now, the reason why I still say I phrase the Lions as in the driver's seat is because they could afford to lose next week and then still find a way to get into the playoffs, get the 1 seed. If Minnesota, even if they win their final game of the season, if they lose to the Packers, they would not end up as the 1 seed, assuming the Lions win out. So there is a scenario where if both teams lose next week, then that final game will determine who gets the 1 seed. But for Minnesota, realistically, they probably have to win both of these next 2 games, which is no guarantee, but I mean, you can't say it can't happen either. Realistically, it's going to be one of those 2 teams as the 1 seed. There is a small chance that it could be the Eagles still, but what they would need is they would need the Vikings to lose both of their next 2 games, and they would need Detroit to lose against San Francisco, they would need Detroit to lose their next 2 games, and then they would need the Vikings to lose to the Packers, but then beat the Lions. So out of those 4 games, the Eagles need them to go exactly a certain way, and the Eagles would have to win out. So they would need 6 games to all go one way for it to happen, including a couple upsets there. So probably not going to happen for, I guess technically 5 games, but probably not going to happen for the Eagles. So that's why I didn't put them on the list. Although, sticking with the Vikings, I'm talking about them in terms of the 1 seed, but there's also the 5 seed at play, which I think you would want. Looking at the NFC South, I think you would want to play whoever is in that division, and just a higher seed gives you a better chance. It's going to, give you better matchups throughout the playoffs, right, if there are upsets and things of that nature. So definitely something you want. They could drop here where, let's say, for example, they play the Packers next week. If they lose to the Packers, well, that would just flip it all together. The Packers would get the 5 seed. You look at the Packers' schedule, so they play the Vikings obviously next week. If they win that, and then assuming that the Lions beat the Vikings on the final game of the season, and then the Packers can beat the Bears, as you see, that would be enough to get the Packers the 5 seed, which would, again, I think help, and I think that's what you would probably want here. So that would definitely be, key. If the Packers do lose one of those 2 games, I have them currently as the 7 seed, assuming Washington does win out. Okay, now the AFC time. Not a ton of surprises. I do have Baltimore back as the 3 seed. We'll get into what happens there, and we'll get into Pittsburgh and all of that. But really, I mean, it feels like, the 4 division winners are going to be Kansas City, Buffalo, Houston, and then either Baltimore or Pittsburgh. And it feels like the Chargers and Broncos will be the 2 other wildcard teams. Although, it's not a guarantee. And let's talk about the craziness going on over here with the entire AFC picture, because like I said, seems like the Chargers or Broncos are in a pretty good spot, but there are a couple of 7 and 8 teams that are 2 games behind both the Chargers and Broncos, trying to see if they can catch up with 2 games left. Well, what has to happen? So first, the Chargers. All the Chargers need to do is win 1 game, and they're good. They've clinched. And you look at their schedule, it seems pretty simple. They play the Patriots and they play the Raiders, which, hey, Patriots played the Bills tough. The Raiders won a game this week. You never know, but you feel pretty good about yourself if you're a Chargers fan. Want to take care of business this week, not even have to have it come down to week 18, but you're in a pretty good spot. Probably the Chargers are going to win a game. They win 1, they are in. If they lose out, then things get, tricky. And in fact, I think if they lose out, they probably don't make the playoffs, but they probably win a game and they're probably fine. As for the Denver Broncos, they're in the exact same situation, except their schedule is a little bit tougher. They play Cincinnati, who is one of those 7 and 8 teams that is fighting for a playoff spot. We'll talk about them later. And then they play the Chiefs. Now, the ultimate X factor of all X factors for Kansas City for Denver is Kansas City might not play their starters the final game of the season. Now, I remember I made a video a few years back. There is some evidence to support you should still play your starters if you have a bye week, because multiple byes can kind of it creates rust, essentially. So you don't want that to happen. So maybe they still play their starters, although I think they would probably rest their starters if they have the 1 seed locked up. And certainly, Mahomes isn't running into design runs in that scenario, right? So it's an easier matchup if the Chiefs have already clinched the 1 seed. So what you need if you're a Broncos fan is, I'm sure it's not difficult for you. So what you need if you're a Broncos fan, which I'm sure is difficult for you, is you need the Chiefs to win. You need to be rooting for Kansas City on Christmas. You need to be rooting for the Chiefs to beat the Steelers. If they do, that would lock them up the 1 seed. You could also get a Bills loss to lock up the 1 seed, but that seems unlikely. So really, you need to try and hope the Chiefs can get the 1 seed. That would essentially make you fine, but it's no guarantee. And what happens if Denver does lose out? Well, similar to the Chargers, I think they probably are out of the playoffs because there's 3 teams behind them, and the Broncos wouldn't have the tiebreaker over any of those 3 teams. So next in line would be the Indianapolis Colts. If the Colts win out and either the Chargers or Broncos lose out, the Colts would be the team that has the tiebreaker over everybody else, and they play the Giants and Jaguars. So realistically, I think the Colts probably have the next best chance, here. And if they can get a Bengals win, who, like I said, will have something to play for next week, that could give the Colts a really good chance to make the playoffs, or at least keep the season alive for another week. Now, if they drop a game, that puts the Miami Dolphins in position. They play the Browns and the Jets, who they did actually, Jets is a divisional matchup, and that game was kind of tight the first time. But if the Dolphins can get a Colts loss, 2 Broncos losses, and they can win out, then they would be in line. If, let's say, they drop that game to the Jets, then that finally opens the door for the Cincinnati Bengals, who play the Broncos. So if they can win that game, and then if they can beat the Steelers the final game of the season, if they win out, what they would still need is a Broncos loss week 18. They would need a Colts loss and a Dolphins loss. So they need a lot of help. In fact, they need help from 3 different teams if they're going to get in, and they have to win out on top of it. But hey, it's week 17 and you're still doing playoff scenarios. At least you have that if you're a Bengals fan, but it seems like it's going to be tough. The 1 seed in the AFC, the Chiefs, this is going to be pretty simple, but we'll still go through it. The Chiefs need a win, and they have clinched the 1 seed. They need a win or a loss. The difficult thing, though, is that their schedule isn't that easy. They're the Chiefs, so you assume they're going to get it, but they play the Steelers and the Broncos. Those are almost certainly two playoff teams that you're looking at right here. So if the Steelers can pull off the upset, which, again, Chiefs on a short week yet again, could things get weird on Christmas? They lost against the Raiders on Christmas last year, so it's certainly possible. And then, I mean, if the Broncos are playing for their playoff lives, the final game of the season, well, okay, maybe that's going to be a loss as well. The Broncos did nearly win the last time they played. It's possible, and if it does happen, you look at the Bills' schedule, they have the Jets and the Patriots, so the Bills can easily go 2-0. That's not the issue, even if they did play both of those two teams actually pretty close to both times they played earlier. There are divisional games. You never know. But you would think that the Bills can go 2-0 relatively easily. Simply the question is, can the Chiefs go 0-2? I wouldn't bet on it, but hey, you never know. So really, I think the biggest implication of the Christmas game, I actually just think, is for the teams that need the Broncos to lose out, you're just hoping that the Steelers can pull off that victory to keep the 1 seed alive, to keep the hope of the 1 seed alive for the Bills, and force the Chiefs to play their starters the final game of the season. Feels like that has the most implications here, not anything else. Although for the Steelers, they actually have big implications. That Christmas Day game matters a lot for playoff implications. If the Steelers, so as of right now, I have the Steelers as the 7 seed. I have them losing their next two against the Chiefs and the Bengals. I don't know, maybe I should have them favored over the Bengals. If they beat the Bengals but lose to the Steelers, that would put them in the 5 seed, which could be what happens. And hey, the Steelers, Texans, there you go. That's a game you could potentially win. If they beat the Kansas City Chiefs, though, next week, this still keeps them, controlling their own destiny for the division lead. As of right now, if they win out, they will get the division lead. I don't have that currently happening. I have them losing both of those games, and I think they probably lose one of them. They probably lose to the Chiefs, right? But hey, the Steelers have pulled off some unbelievable victories in the past, so who knows? Maybe they could pull it off and still get the division lead. That would put them at the 3 seed, and as of right now, it would have them, if my projections hold, playing the Chargers in the first game of the playoffs. Although for the Baltimore Ravens, it's no guarantee that they can get the division lead as well, just because they happen to get a Steelers loss, because they then have to win out on top of it. So what they need is to win out to make sure they get the division, which again, you want the division, gives you better matchups. If there's an upset, you can get that second playoff home game. We saw that last year with the Detroit Lions, who were the 3 seed but ended up getting the home game in the divisional round because the Cowboys, who were the 2 seed, lost, if you remember. They can definitely go 2-0, although playing the Texans on Christmas, that's no guarantee, and that game matters as well. So if they drop that one, Pittsburgh's okay if they lose to the Chiefs. They just have to win against the Bengals the final game of the season. So that's a big game as well for Baltimore, assuming Pittsburgh loses. Also, if that happened, the Texans would jump up to the 3 seed. So, like we said, seeding still matters. So, yeah, that's where all of that is. So, yeah, a lot of craziness. We definitely have, things have gotten more simple here as we've kind of eliminated the teams that were hanging around. There's still a couple teams that are hanging around, but it feels like all the teams that are hanging around have like a legitimate chance. I think the worst team that we talked about, the team with the least odds, is probably the Seattle Seahawks right here, although it's still not impossible. They just need a little bit of help. I guess really, actually, I would disagree. I think the worst odds is still probably the Cincinnati Bengals or one of those teams, I would think. But nothing is impossible here, and you got to try and just so for some of these teams, you got to try and just keep hope alive, find a way to, get through to next week and see what you can do there. But either way, it is a very entertaining final stretch here. There is a chance that all of these games could be decided. If Atlanta wins and Tampa Bay loses, then Atlanta clinches the division. If the Rams win and either to get better tiebreakers or the Seahawks lose, the Rams can clinch the division. We already talked about how, if Tampa Bay loses, that would clinch at least a wild card spot, or it would definitely clinch a wild card spot for the Commanders there. And if the Broncos and Chargers both win, week 18 could be for nothing, even if, maybe the Chiefs win and then the Lions win and the Vikings lose, and it could even be for a 1 seed. We'll see. Hopefully it doesn't happen. Hopefully we get some drama in the final game. But yeah, those are my thoughts on all of this. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.